Did you know that the Muslims of Bosnia were put under the longest siege of a capital city in modern history, and yet they still won the war? You see, in the 1960s, Bosnia was under the control of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, a communist country situated in the heart of the Balkans, a land of many small nations, each fighting with each other over even smaller plots of land. And here lived the Slovenes, the Croats, the Bosnians, the Serbs, the Albanians, the Montenegrins, and the Macedonians, among others, each with their own language and history and religion, tied together under the rule of a communist government. And in 1963, a man named Josip Tito secured control over this country and was named president for life. For the next 17 years, he ruled the country with an iron fist, banning any dissenting opinions about the Communist Party while also crushing any semblance of nationalism within the country in an effort to put an end to the rising ethnic tensions. He worked tirelessly to appease and to punish the various ethnic groups equally, hoping to unite the people of Yugoslavia under the banner of communism. But nationalism was too deeply rooted in the Balkans, and when Tito eventually died in 1980, the unity of Yugoslavia began to slowly unravel, and once again, the rising tide of nationalism threatened to dissolve the sovereignty of the country and create a mess of ever-moving borders. The largest and the most influential people in the country were the Serbs, and the capital city of Yugoslavia was in their territory. Tito had managed to keep a balance of power since he himself was a Croat and not a Serb, and so after his death, that balance was no longer there, and the other non-Serbian ethnic groups began to feel that they no longer had a place within the Yugoslav state. And so in 1991, Croatia declared independence, and the first of the Yugoslav wars had begun. In that same year, Slovenia and Macedonia both managed to gain their independence with very little resistance, while fighting continued between the Croats and the Serbs. Soon, both the Yugoslav government and the Yugoslav army would be completely dominated by the Serbs as other ethnicities fled during the fighting. And now, under the leadership of Slobodan Milosevic, it soon became clear that the Serbs were no longer trying to maintain a united Yugoslavia, but rather create a greater Serbian empire. And this put the Bosnians at a crossroads. At the time, the president of Bosnia was Alija Izetbegovic, a devout Muslim who had written extensively calling for an Islamic renewal and reconciliation between Islam and modernization, all from the perspective that Islam was the true guiding light. He publicly criticized both the Croats and the Serbs, saying that choosing between the two sides was like choosing between leukemia and a brain tumor. Wanting no part of that, in 1992, under his leadership, Bosnia and Herzegovina declared independence. But there was a problem. Within the territory of Bosnia, there was a huge population of both Serbs and Croats, and now these Serbs and Croats also declared their own independent states in retaliation, eventually leading to a three-way civil war within Bosnia, which was already inside of a civil war within Yugoslavia. And that's when the killing began. Serbs began seeking out Muslim homes, ransacking them before burning them down. They would then round up civilians and separate the men from the women, sending the men to concentration camps or executing them, and abusing the women in unspeakable ways. Throughout the war, tens of thousands of Muslims were killed, and over 1 million were deported or forcibly resettled in an attempt to ethnically cleanse Republika Srpska of its non-Serbian inhabitants. This process was then repeated by the Croats in the south when they began their own offensive, although the numbers affected there were much less. And then there was the city of Sarajevo. The Serbs managed to encircle the capital city with 13,000 soldiers stationed in the surrounding hills, where they rained down artillery and tank fire from above and sent snipers and troops into the city. Sarajevo now found itself under siege, and what would become the longest siege of a capital city in the history of modern warfare, where tens of thousands of innocent civilians would lose their lives. And then in a final act of treachery, a Bosnian politician offered himself as a puppet to the Serbs, assisted them in besieging another Bosnian city in the west, and carved out a little piece of Bosnia for himself. And all the while this was happening, the international community was watching. And by the way, if you want to support the channel and help me pay my editors, you can sign up for my Patreon, link in the YouTube video description or on my TikTok profile. Anyway, the UN began to send food and aid to civilians, and NATO announced a no-fly zone over Bosnia. but this did little to prevent the killing of civilians that was taking place on the ground. In 1993, the UN then announced it would set up a series of safe zones where civilians would flee to and the UN would protect them. In response, Izet Begovic predicted that these safe havens would become death traps, where refugees, thinking they were safe, would instead become easy targets for the Serbian forces. He turned out to be right. Towards the end of the war in 1995, some 2,000 Serbs descended on the safe zone in Srebrenica, where civilians had been disarmed by the UN and were now under the protection of only 300 UN peacekeepers. And they did nothing to prevent what happened next. Nearly 8,400 Bosnian Muslims were killed in the massacre, in what the International Court of Justice later ruled a clear case of genocide. But even though the Serbs had a clear military advantage on the ground, the international community was beginning to side with the Bosnians, and Serbia was at risk of becoming a pariah state. Feeling the pressure, Slobodan Milosevic cut ties with the Serbs in Bosnia in 1994, refusing to send more weapons and money. And that same year, the US helped broker a peace deal between Bosnia and the Croatian Republic of Herzegovina, thus ending the civil war within the war. Soon the Bosnians and the Croats began a united offensive, taking back many towns and villages from the Serbs, who at one point had held more than 70% of the country. Heroes of the Bosnian War would make their names here. One brigade commander by the name of Izet Nanic would famously liberate village after village before eventually fighting his way to the city of Bihać, which was still under siege by the breakaway Bosnian Republic. And there he was killed in action, dying the death of a shaheed, inshallah, on the day they managed to lift the siege and free the city. The Serbs were now under extreme pressure by both the Bosnian offensive and the international community, and on December 14th, 1995, the presidents of Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia signed a peace agreement ending the nearly 4-year-long war. And over the next 2 months, as the siege of Sarajevo was being lifted and the Serbs were slowly being driven back, one final act of terrorism occurred when on January 9th, 1996, a single rocket-propelled grenade was fired at a tram running down the main street of Sarajevo, killing a 55-year-old woman and wounding 19 others. The grenade was fired from a building which was held by the Serbs at the time, but the perpetrator was never found, and he remains a mystery until this day. In the end, the Bosnian people showed bravery and resilience like no other, and by fighting for their freedom despite the odd against them, they managed to win the hearts of the international community, which, in the long run, came to their advantage and allowed them to win the war.
Takbir! Allahu Akbar! Takbir! Allahu Akbar! Takbir! Allahu Akbar!
Like and follow for more Muslim Facts.